Today on our Tech for Business podcast, Todd, our COO and CISO, and Nate, our Director of Cybersecurity, are here talking to you and me, the end user, about our role in incident response. So, Todd, to kind of set the stage a little bit, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that end users like me have about our role in cybersecurity?
Great question. I don't know if you fall into this category because you're not. It's a great question. I think most end users to some degree, and I don't want this to come across too terribly rude, but it's somebody else's job, right? I've got a cybersecurity department. I outsource my cybersecurity. It's not really my problem. And the reason why I like the question is because when I do training, especially if I can do it in person, is I usually try to make the connection of if I can make it important to you in your home life, it translates directly to the organization as well. The organization is trying to do all the things they can, but in the end, it's not solely them. Everybody plays a role in cybersecurity. Case in point, the vast majority of events still come through phishing, and that's where they get most people, and they target everybody. While they do go after the whales like the CEOs and whatnot, they're really going after anybody and everybody. So the more that they go after, the better. So I would say the biggest misconception is that's not my problem.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I could go take a look at the latest Verizon data breach report. I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but I believe it's like 80% or 90%. It's somewhere in there, 80, 90, usually year over year is of confirmed data breaches that they result in some type of human interaction. And so I think maybe one of the other misconceptions is that oftentimes you'll hear security or like users are your weakest link, right? And if you're listening to the podcast, you're like, I feel terrible now, right? Like you just told me that 80 to 90% of data breaches result from
Oh,
me.
neat.
Users are the weakest link, like that's not the words of encouragement, you know. But if we flip that around, you can also be some of the best defense, right? So if we know that 80, 90% of them can possibly be prevented with user training or anything like that, that's encouraging, right? Now you can kind of completely flip the kind of the statistics, right? And then also, there's security tools, right? There's so much that it can see, but maybe something, slips through the spam filter and there's an actual phishing email. If you report that to your IT department or security department or someone, well, now they can go back and make sure that the tools are maybe tuned a little bit better or add some manual blocks. But again, that's the end user that's driving security. So to Todd's point is it's everyone's job, right, to have a culture of security. But don't be discouraged when you hear that end users are often the weakest link to the security chain. So
For sure. Well, you kind of answered my question a little bit about the importance of that awareness and training. And I was thinking of the same statistic. So I'm going to find it about the human element and how that's kind of, a big weakness sometimes. But we mentioned phishing. And I think when the end user thinks about their role in cybersecurity and incident response, that's the first thing I think of. Oh, all the phishing emails and the phishing training. So let's kind of start there and sort of talk a little bit about how some of those threats are evolving and what a little bit of the end user should be aware of. We have a lot of tools, but what should I be paying attention to when it comes to those types of threats?
Yeah, kind of circling back just a hair on where Nate was going. I wanted to expand on that briefly. Is end user training is really where the rubber hits the road for our perspective. Is if you're aware of, and again, I know we're going to get a little stats heavy. Is 50% of all organizations suffer some sort of event, and if 80% of those are end user related, those statistics are pretty much you're at a flip of a coin whether it's going to happen or not, and who is really the problem. So even this is a bit of training of if you're aware of what's happening, you can do something about it. So getting into phishing, things that you're seeing that are massively changing is AI is everywhere, right? You hear it all the time. The attempts are getting significantly more sophisticated. Oddly enough, the most recent targeted phishing I got was from one of our marketing people. It was an area. Okay, anybody's curious. But being as that it's the beginning of the year, the one I got was, hey, my payroll didn't come through, and it was immediately after payday, and my payroll didn't come through. I need to update my ACH. Can you help me? And it looked good. It had the signature. Everything was legitimate. It was just, there was only a couple of little telltale signs. One, that person would have never communicated to me the way that they did. So that was a nice, easy one of that's not legit. But the others were, there was the typical telltale, right? That it was a specific email address that they wouldn't have used had they really had that concern, was another one that was a nice telltale. I'll let Nate go too, but there's tons of telltales of what's going on.
The other telltale sign is here at CIT, we only volunteer our time because we love working here so much that we don't get paychecks, right?
That's right. No
You get
payroll.
modified paycheck if you don't get paid. So just kidding. I think some of the other things are just as the end user, like kind of disseminating why does phishing even happen, right? There's obviously, a lot of motives behind it. Financial is usually the biggest one. But when we say, why me, right? We kind of dig in a little bit more specifically, right? Yes, there's the ones like, the CEOs, the CFOs, those high value targets. But, when we start talking about like, how does end user contribute to the broader cybersecurity or, security posture of an organization? Like, why me? I'm just a, maintenance tech. I just fix parts all day, right? I barely check my email. Or like that's a legit conversation I've had in the past when I worked for a manufacturing organization, or things like, why me? It doesn't matter, right? The role, there's a lot of different roles in an organization, but oftentimes there's a bigger game of chess going on, right? Yes, we are looking for the king, or the queen of the chessboard, but sometimes we have our pawns and our rooks and and knights. And so what threat actors are trying to do is they are, sacrificing certain pieces at times to make a bigger play in. I've been watching a lot of chess recently, so it's the analogy I'm going with. But what we often see is there's a kind of that brain prey approach, right? It's just a numbers game. Is if they can get 0.2% of all people, you compromise an account, you get in there and you launch the next attack. And so oftentimes, if you don't have much of value in like your mailbox or the access in your environment, it's just the launching point to get the next contact list to hopefully get, that 0.2% of the next people. And maybe somewhere in the past you've communicated with a CFO or, an accounts payable individual, and they fall for it. Then that's when they start actually taking kind of more of that strategic approach to try and set up a larger, like a wire transfer or something. So how can you as the end user feel important? You are really like helping lay that security at the foundation to try and really prevent those around you from getting compromised as well. So, and then the other things that are evolving, this is kind of old news at this point, but in the past, it used to just be password compromises, and then they get in and do what they need to do. But the problem with that is as soon as they blast out emails, someone knows that it's compromised and they change the password, and they get restricted. With the more modern ones, which the last 3 years at this point, is they typically do what they call an OAuth attack, which, don't worry, I won't go into all the technical details, but basically it's a application that you add to your account that gives it more of a persistent access. So even if you change the password, the application still has access. And so we see a lot of those types of attacks. So we've been working with IT admins to try and help prevent some of that from happening. But if you ever are, going through a phishing email and says, we need to link this application to your account in order to proceed, stop. If anything's trying to link to your email account, just talk to your IT department.
Yeah. So kind of giving an example of the OAuth just for reference is Connect with Google would be a great example of what that would look like. Those types of attacks where you're using that supply chain to kind of authenticate. I did think that it was great that Nate covered the perfect way to avoid phishing is you just don't answer your emails and you're good.
That's what I do.
Like all delete.
Problem
They'll call you
solved.
back.
Yep. They'll call back. Oh gosh.
Usually if it is very important, they will pick up the phone and call, right?
Yep.
Most people.
I've deleted Todd's email for years. So.
You wouldn't believe how well it works.
Oh, that's great. I think it's interesting what you mentioned, Nate, about considering the why. Why is this happening? And I've seen an interesting evolution, even in the short amount of time that I've been in this field, from just training to really a culture in fostering that cybersecurity culture. So to diverge a little bit, how can businesses really develop that sense of culture rather than just here's a training, here's what you need to know, and kind of having that very surface level versus a really deep understanding for everyone? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's a big
Probably
question.
the first thing I'd say is, whatever, timestamp this spot, and I'm going to have you send this to your executives. Because this is going to be tailored more towards them than the broader employees. Is as executives, do not punish your employees if they make a security mistake, right? If they accidentally fall for something, you don't fire them because of that, right? Is if it's a very continual thing, no matter what, maybe you need to have a harder conversation there. But the people make mistakes, and you have to foster a culture of, if it's kind of is it the TSA saying, if you see something, say something, right? Is helping employees be comfortable saying, I think something happened, and you need to be aware of it, and not punishing them for it, right? And just saying, thank you for, bringing it to our attention. We'll dig into it. That has to happen, because otherwise end users are going to have a fear of, maybe retaliation or, some type of penalty if they caused a security incident, right? There's potentially a lot of money on the line in these cases. So you have to build a culture of trust first and foremost. And then once that's established and, and everyone's comfortable being able to report things like that, for the end users, be comfortable reporting it. And sometimes there's an ego that will get in the way, saying, I would never fall for a phishing email. Trust me, security people fall for phishing emails from time to time, right?
Everybody can.
But kind of setting the ego aside and saying, I made a mistake, right? I need to tell someone about it, because it could quickly balloon into a larger issue. So,
I think culture is amazing. There's a lot in there to unpack, and I'd like to talk to about culture for like 20 minutes, but I'll try to keep it a little bit brief. My input is, I started this at the beginning, is I think when you can relate security to a person in their home life, I think that makes a huge difference, right? So it instantly says, oh boy, that happens to me at home when I get the, whatever, your Amazon package is coming, or I get you wouldn't believe how many text messages I get about the USPS delivery that is delayed, or I need to click here on my phone. Thankfully, my phone provider actually blocks most of those, but I still get an enormous number of them. But that's a good place to start. I do like what Nate was going after too. In my opinion, the phishing simulations are a wonderful tool, and for several reasons. If somebody's going to fail, I would much rather they had a failure in a test than in real world. Where Nate was kind of going, oh, hey, I would never do that. We often see in the cybersecurity world, will come with, I didn't click on that. I shouldn't have to take the training. It's like, it takes minutes to go through the training. Just do it. And the likelihood of you actually clicking on it are relatively high, and it's okay. So if you can kind of build that into the culture as you're a helper in this situation, you're helping the organization get better. And I specifically used helper in that line because there was a psychological culture shift when somebody helps, it's one thing, but when you're a helper, it's a totally different message to being sent. But when you're getting into those situations, it allows you to have conversations. Says this is a safe environment. We're here together. We're working through this together. It's a major problem, and you're going to help the organization get better. It's not really designed to find, oh, aha, this person failed it. Shame on you. It's none of those types of things. So when we've done tests with companies, we don't do a whole lot of this anymore. I think this is where one of those culture shifts have happened. But a lot of times back in the good old days, you'd have someone go, well, who failed? And they'd say, can you give me the list? And we're kind of going, yeah, we really don't recommend doing that because you don't need to go and talk to that individual about them failing. So long as they took the training, that's all we're looking for. So you don't really see that a whole lot anymore. But if you have people asking that, kind of going back to Nate's point of make the note for your executive team, this is not a punishment thing. If you have a problem where it's reoccurring and somebody is really struggling, there's a deeper seated issue, and certainly sit down and go, hey, we've seen that there's been a handful of issues here that we need to work through. But that's a totally different story. More often than not, you don't see repeat offenders when it comes to security training in particular. So kind of going through what this looks like from us is we typically start pretty easy. There's, back in the good old days, it was like, hey, this email came in with pink background. That's weird. That's not good. And then you slowly build on it. Now, for most organizations that we work, we try to go through a maturity model where you get very tough, right? So if we're not nice at this point, it's, hey, you're going to start getting fake W-2s because it's payroll time and tax time for us in the United States. And a year is going to be fake Amazon package alerts, et cetera. We're going to be pretty tough on you. But again, the intent here is the reason why we're doing this is this makes you safe at home as well as in the office. And we're trying to build if you ever have questions, this is a great time to ask.
My proudest achievement on the not being nice is I got our CEO to step away from dinner because saw an email thinking someone logged in and called me saying help. Like, gotcha.
Nice.
So, yeah, we can be pretty mean, but
for sure.
When Nate says we can be really mean, we're tougher on our employees than we are on our customers.
Yes.
Our whole system's configured with AI to where if you've been successful in one type, it flips to a different type that maybe it thinks you might be a little weaker at. Start testing that. So
wild. That's crazy. So we talked a lot about phishing, which I kind of said was sort of, as the end users, the thing that I'm bombarded the most with. But what are the things that are still a risk to the end user that I don't often think about?
Yeah. I'll go pick on passwords.
Yeah.
There's the top 100 password list that gets released year over year. And it is, if you take a look at the top 6 passwords, it is the same passwords for the last decade.
That's where I get my ideas. When I got
yeah. It's going to be your password 1 2 3 4 5 6. I love you. Pick your pet's name, pick the season, the year, add an exclamation mark. It'd be, change it up and put the exclamation mark at the beginning instead of the end or something. But
it's good security. Nobody expects that.
Favorite colors, right? We humans are really bad at picking passwords. And so this is one where the other problem is as we move to more cloud solutions, the application sprawl just becomes larger and larger and larger, right? So there's more and more passwords to have. And so this just goes back to the importance of password managers. Password managers historically have very low adoption rates. I think in the past, I've looked at like even our customer adoption rate, and it was like 11%. So, it's one of those things where you can provide the tool, but you have to get people to actually use it, right? It's like the saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And so for organizations, it gets back to widely adopting a password manager together. And there's ways that you can do this. So you can set up shared folders. So if the marketing team has one login for one application, have a group folder. Now, in order to access an application, you have to have 3 or 4 people into this application or into the password manager to be able to use it. And so they start grabbing the passwords. And if the password changes, got to go back to the password manager to grab it, right? Then there's other things where, we're going to be like a LastPass, partner and everything like that, is in these cases, when you have LastPass, they also extend free licensing for your personal life. So kind of to Todd's point earlier about, building the personal culture into it as well, is use a password manager at home, right? Especially if your company is essentially paying for it for you. And so at that point, you can say, okay, great. I protected all my work passwords, but at home, I'm still using winter 2025 exclamation mark as my password. The most dangerous thing you can do is, in your personal life, is password reuse, especially on things where there's finances or email. Email is one that people often think isn't critical because, it's like, oh, it's my personal and I just receive junk email to it all day. But in order to access your online accounts, you have to have an email address. And so if they don't know the password, all they do is just say, reset my password. It sends you an email confirmation, and then they get in, and then they can start resetting other account passwords for other services because they have all the emails. They know which accounts you have, right? And so that's where using the password managers, making sure that at a minimum, your finance and your email have unique, strong passwords and multi-factor everything. But then going through the rest of your applications is going to be really critical. Last thing I promise is it extends further as well, right? Is disaster recovery in your home life. What happens if you pass away or, something happens and your family needs access to your accounts? Having a password manager with all the emergency access set up, ready to go, will save your family a lot of hassle in the future, right? Is when my grandma passed, I had to go through that little black book where over 20 years, the password has changed 15 times and trying to figure out which one is the right password. And if it was just a password manager, all the current passwords, my life would have been easy.
Yeah, one thing that I would add on to the passwords is if you're in a business and you're still allowing 8-character passwords, it's probably enough. That's where you're running into the winter 2025. If you're really clever, you probably do winter 2026 because you're ahead of the game. But that's where you kind of start to break those things that they're no longer capable of using that because you use a much longer password. We hate passwords. Everybody hates them. There is password lists on the future. We'll worry about that in another podcast, but that's a way to go about it too. But in the interim, I agree with Nate. The password managers are a game changer.
Yeah, password lists is actually something that for end users, like even in your personal life, sometimes you're able to actually jump on that earlier than some of the businesses can. This is where oftentimes you're seeing things like, hey, do you want to log into your email, right? It'll say, do you want to set up a passkey? Yeah, set up a passkey, right? Like maybe your phone, it'll actually store the passkey on there. And so you can access it on, I'm an iOS person, but on your phone, your tablet, it syncs it across. And now you're getting true passwordless, but it's a very strong method of logging in. So if you ever get prompted to set up passkeys, do it.
Yeah, it's not nearly as complicated or as intimidating as it appears. They will walk you through it.
Yes. So we talked a little bit about if, I get that phishing email and I click on this link, or if something happens, sort of what the end user needs to do. And what does that look like? I mean, when something happens, when I click on a link, hopefully you don't, but what are kind of those steps if an incident happens for the end user?
Using my personal life as an example is my mom calls me.
Yeah.
And then she calls the number on the screen, even though we've talked about it.
Oh my gosh.
So just a couple of tips if you're watching at home and don't know what I mean, is occasionally my mom will click on something. As far as she knows, she doesn't use a web browser. She uses Facebook. And I was like, well, how do you get to Facebook? And she's like, what do you mean? It's just Facebook. Anyways, every once in a while, she'll click on something that she shouldn't and it gets into a situation where she gets a prompt on the screen. And that prompt almost always is trying to get them to do something, right? In this case, is often not the ones that she gets are the ones that say, call this phone number to get help immediately. And she'll usually take a picture with her cell phone and it's usually blurry and I can't see what's going on. So it's quickly a phone call, but don't click the link. Don't make the call. Microsoft's never going to ask you to call. So a lot of those kinds of things would be talk to the professional that you know, right? So if this is happening in your business world, you will, even if you don't have a very robust security team, you do have an IT team, and they do know a lot about cybersecurity, so they can step in right away. There are things as an incident happens that we want to retain. So turning off the computer, pulling the plug, all those kinds of things we don't really always want to see, but we can work through them. But the first thing I do is contact the professionals, and they can jump in and start to help you through the process.
Yeah, the notifying the individuals, I would say just if your company has a defined incident response plan that they've shared, that's going to be the most important thing, is follow whatever the procedures have already been defined. I've worked for organizations where it's you go online and submit a form and it notifies the proper individuals. Sometimes it's an email. Sometimes it's just calling someone that you trust, right? And
Mhm.
um, for the IT teams listening to this, set up multiple avenues for someone to reach you, right? Don't be the IT person that says, "Is there a ticket?" and ignoring any other requests, because I've seen that before, right?
Mhm.
And we've had customers where they notify their own internal IT team saying, "I'm actually concerned that I just clicked on the phishing email and gave up my credentials," and IT looks at it and says, "Yeah, it looks fine to me." And then turns out there's a wire transfer request like brewing in the background, and it's happened. So IT, take them seriously. End users, just notify someone. And it doesn't matter really how, just follow your company's procedures. Um, the the other thing, if there is something where there's like clearly ransomware, like your files are getting completely overwritten, I'd prefer you shut down the computer. Like, yes, we want to gather forensics off that device, likely. There's something that they call running memory, which is where can we see the applications that are actively running. If you're on the network, it's better just to shut it down, right? That running memory will help, but also not encrypting the rest of the network is more important. So um, it's okay to just shut down your computer. Ideally, contact a professional, but if something's clearly encrypting, just get
For
it
sure.
offline.
Yeah.
That's usually my best tip for my mother too, is just power it off.
Mm.
Even though I said don't necessarily do that, that is usually the first step. She's like, I can't get out of it. I can't escape. I can't turn it off.
The most secure device is an offline device.
It's the same thing with emails, right? That's how we started this conversation.
Oh my gosh, full circle. Goodness. Well, to kind of close out, we've talked a lot about end users and what they need to do. But from the now flipping it back to cybersecurity professionals, I mean, is there any advice or action steps or any challenges that you see them facing when working with their end users and how they can kind of better that communication?
Yeah, the best advice that I think I would throw out there is for a security person. I mean, just in general, be patient. One of the things that we try to teach here is take care of the things that you need to take care of, right? If you have a real incident, you know what's going down, and you've done a handful of little things like turning the device off, et cetera. Go to the bathroom, get your drink, do the things that you need to do. But the number one thing that I wanted to get in place was be patient with the person you're talking to. This may be the 600th time you've seen this fake
Mhm.
phishing email, but it's probably there first. So work with them, be patient with them, tell them what they're looking at, why they're looking at it, why it's a concern or not, and kind of work through it with them. It's their first time going through this as well.
Yeah. Uh, the thing that I'd probably say about for IT professionals is still work with a dedicated security professional, especially one that has experience with incident response. It's one thing to do the initial contain a threat, but oftentimes you need to go figure out what actually happened along the way. Because let's just go pick an email compromise. Sometimes it might just be an email compromise, but once someone's in that mailbox, usually they're, looking at certain, files, or emails that are maybe of interest, or set up persistence in order to remain hidden. You need to work with a dedicated security professional to uncover all of that. And then also when it comes to uh, like major security incidents, if an end user does introduce, let's say, ransomware into the environment, you have to work with, maybe your insurance, but again, you have to get a proper security person in there. I've seen too many incidents where, IT says, I'm just going to get this resolved and working, and we're going to be back on the security incident response and forensics is a dedicated security field that people make entire careers out of. And it's because it's so tied up into very specific, detailed processes that have to happen to do it effectively and efficiently. So it's one where I'm like, I want to trust you, to say, I believe you're competent to do it, but you have to make sure that if you haven't done it before, you do it right.
Yeah.
Otherwise, bigger consequences. So
Yeah, I think I'm kind of making a handful of assumptions that if you're the professional, this may be not the podcast too to some degree, but yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm being patient with it. It's getting it up as fast as humanly possible is not necessarily the right path. So again, getting back to the be patient, work your way through it, do the due diligence, cross your T's, dot your I's.
yeah, just because ransomware is easy to talk about, the average downtime for ransomware is about 2 weeks if you don't have solid backups.
It's not a race. You don't need to beat that timestamp. You can do it right.
Yeah. But like the average is 2 weeks. Sometimes it's going to be longer than that. Sometimes it's way quicker, right? I've had customers recover in 2 hours from a ransomware incident, but that you're going to have a lot of pressure from your executives along the way saying, get this back up and operational as fast as possible. So as the IT professional, when we say you have to do it right, there's often a lot of training to say, I understand, but we have to follow the proper procedure. Otherwise, we risk kind of that reinfection.
Yeah, I love this conversation, by the way, so I'm not ready to be done. You brought it up earlier as the incident response plan too, is if your organization doesn't have one, you should. Going back to if 50% of companies are not likely to have an incident, you're flipping a coin. So you should probably do your due diligence and build the plan. The plan will really start to help spell out this is the concept everybody gets, right? In case of fire, break glass, get the extinguisher, move forward. Easy procedure. But doing that for the rest of it makes a lot of sense. And where I was really going with this is tailing off of what Nate was just talking about is testing your plan. It's great to have a plan, but if you test the plan and you make sure that you include the appropriate people, executives in Nate's example, then there's less, why is it taking so long? What's happening? And if you can get really into the weeds with your testing and get mature with it, they'll know, waiting on the lawyers, waiting on the forensics, waiting on the whatever. And so those things are great pieces too, but maybe this tallies into another incident response podcast.
For sure. I mean, yeah, I think we should definitely talk a little bit deeper into incident response, but bringing it back to the end user, I mean, is there a world in which you test it from their end? Like just like a phishing email, we practice not clicking on it. I mean, how many employees could we ask and say, probably all of them would know who to call, but would they? You've clicked on this link. Now what do you do? I mean, is there a tabletop exercise for your back to the chess, your pawns, your bishops? I don't know. Is it worth doing that?
Yeah. Ask. I mean, that's the best way to test your policies and procedures and the adoption of them, right? Is bring some random person into your tabletop exercise and say, Steve, you clicked on the phishing link. What do you do? Right?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, and it really does depend on the maturity of the organization. Most people are going to focus on the business critical stuff,
right?
But conceptually, I love it. I mean, I actually we're doing strategic planning literally tomorrow, and I'm doing tabletop exercises with the leadership teams. They're a little bit different than the straight security ones. So while Nate will be there, I'm not going out of my way to go, here's a technical problem, solve it, Nate. It's more on business. What are you doing? How are you communicating, et cetera. But it's exactly to your point is we're at a level of maturity that I want them to focus on specific things. And so we're doing that testing tomorrow. I did give Nate the heads up so he knows it's coming anyway. But normally I would be like, hey, guess what? This is what's happening. And now what are you going to do, right? Nate's not available. Now what are you going to do? So yes, I think they're incredibly important for a lot of people. And the further you can get into the organization, the better. It probably wouldn't be where I started, but eventually if you could get there, that's a great goal.
For sure. Anything else you want to share or that we missed on this podcast? We'll definitely come back to incident response in the future because that's incredibly important.
Yeah, just for end users, you had mentioned how do the end users test? The one thing I'd ask is, where do you store your files? Yeah, there's so many people that store it on their local hard drive, never save it up to like a OneDrive or back to the file share in the server. Or in the server. So if you're working on critical stuff, just make sure it's properly backed up, because something like ransomware comes sweeping through your environment. You don't want to lose those files, right? There's going to be broader, bigger issues to, the organization to kind of handle and deal with. But if it was never on the server, it probably never got backed up. So for the stuff that was critical to you, making sure that it's saved in like a OneDrive or somewhere where you can get a copy of it again. So just ask yourself, am I saving everything in my downloads folder or my desktop and working from there?
That's good advice. Well, thank you so much, Todd and Nate, for joining us today.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this topic, please let us know. Like, subscribe, or reach out to us at info@cit-net.com or head out to our website, cit-net.com/podcast. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode.